This episode of Us and Them is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation.
Hey, it's Trey K, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide Americans. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've learned some things about me and my childhood growing up in Charleston, West Virginia. My middle-class family always had enough food and clothes growing up, but I've faced some tough times, too. My parents divorced, and my dad became a quadriplegic, and he died 10 years later at a relatively young age. As a kid, I faced some emotional and physical abuse. I'll bet you can relate because many of us have a personal list of adverse experiences. No matter who you are or where you're from, adversity is a part of being human. A recent Centers for Disease Control and Prevention study of more than 144,000 adults found 61% reported an adverse childhood experience. Some people who study this call those ACEs for short. ACEs is a term you're going to hear a lot more about in this episode, and we'll talk more about that later. Traumas can span a wide range. Some last for years, while others are one-time events with lifelong effects. Neglect, abuse, violence. Trauma can be physical and psychological. Decades of research reveals that exposure to adversity in childhood, even one seriously traumatic event during a sensitive period in development, can lead to chronic mental and physical problems later in life. A national survey says nearly half the kids under 18 in the U.S. have had an adverse experience or serious trauma. But what constitutes a trauma and how each of us experiences it, children or adults, is totally subjective.
I feel 90 sometimes. I don't drink, smoke. I'm on a no-stress diet, let's put it that way. Try not to get stressed, but I do, but I don't show it.
Joanna is 69. We're not using her last name to protect her privacy and her family's. She's an African-American woman living in southwestern West Virginia. She's retired from a long career in public education. Despite looking healthy and fit, she's got some pretty serious health concerns.
I am a 23-year colon cancer survivor. I've had a stent put in my heart. I just became a type 2 diabetic. I've been through a lot, but God's not through with me yet.
Trauma has been defined as the lasting effects of emotional shock. That shock can come in many forms. For Joanna, it was a voicemail.
She said, "Hey, Mom." She was hoarse because she used to choke her out a lot, too. I could tell she had been through something.
In 2015, Joanna got a message from her 31-year-old daughter, Tiffany, who was living in Mississippi with an abusive husband. She also used drugs.
She said, "Hey, Mom, I'm just calling to wish you a happy birthday and to let you know that Kurt was talking about killing me tonight." I wasn't at home. She just left a message. "And if anything happens to me, you know he did it." And I played that over 1,000 times.
A month later, Joanna's daughter Tiffany was dead.
I was in denial. I was in denial when my sister came down and told me, and I went to my bathroom and locked myself up in the bathroom. I called Mississippi to the house she was living in. I think he's the one that answered the phone. I said, "May I speak to Tiffany?" he said, Tiffany's no longer with us. And I said, what do you mean? Tiffany's no longer with us. And he said, she died. That's it. And that's when I went off. I was not myself for 2 years. I lost like 25 pounds. I wasn't eating, It's still hard to believe, but I was in denial when I got that phone call. But that's a phone call you don't want to get about your child.
Joanna traveled to Mississippi to view her daughter's body and to find her granddaughter. Joanna had met her granddaughter once before. She didn't know much about M. We're going to use her first initial just to protect her privacy. Joanna says M was born when Tiffany was high on crack cocaine. M is 11 now, living with Joanna here in West Virginia. I met with them to talk about the traumas they've survived. I expected M would be shy meeting me, but she is poised and polite. She looks and acts older than her age. She is tall with long arms and legs. There's a lightness to M that surprises me, given all the heaviness of her mom's death and all that she's been through. She was just 5 when her father shot and killed her mom in the family bathroom. M was playing outside nearby. She told me what she remembered about that day.
Oh, she was in the bathroom, right? And then when I was looking out the window to see what my dad was doing, then I left to go play with a basketball with my cousins. And then I heard a gunshot, and then I hurried up and ran to the bedroom, and then I saw everyone like crying. And I saw like my aunt and my one of my cousins, she was a girl, and my dad hovering over her body and crying. So I was crying because I saw my dad going to jail.
So did the police come and take him away?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
Scary, and I was crying a lot because I was like worried about my dad and all of my other family. So.
M's father is in prison now. It took 18 months for Joanna to get custody of M and bring her to West Virginia. M spent nearly a year in foster care, adding more stress to an already traumatic situation. Joanna says that when they were first together, M would not leave her side, even when she went to the mailbox. Joanna says her granddaughter has terrible nightmares and trouble sleeping.
She just wake up screaming and hollering, and I made recordings on my phone. It's long gone. All night long, Nana, 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 I can't sleep, Nana, 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 I can't sleep. This was 2 years. I was not sleeping, so I went in my living room. We slept in the living room for 2 years because she could not sleep. She was having nightmares, scared of her shadow. Or one night she woke me up, just screaming and hollering. I said, what is it? She was pointing at her backpack. I said, what is it? She have all these little dolls and stuff that hang on the outside and stuff. They're evil. I said, who's evil? What are you talking about? Those things on my backpack. I said, no, they're not. Your mind playing tricks on you. Go back to bed. I said, oh, God, help this child.
It's been 5 years since Joanna adopted M. Joanna says her granddaughter still has trouble focusing and can be delusional. She says M is very anxious and can't sit still.
But she has come a long way. When I first got her, she was like a squirrel on crack. I mean, she was just running, she couldn't sit down. She couldn't focus. The first 2 years in elementary, the teachers had to hold her down. That's how bad she was. She was just traumatized and couldn't focus and, just very destructive. Everything she touched, she'd tear up because she saw that in her life. Her life been torn apart. So she would tear up stuff. She hates going in the store. When I first took her in the store, when I first got her, she was all over the place, under clothes and knocking over stuff and stuff. I said, I can't deal with this. She was climbing across the counters, and it was just crazy. She had no control of how her behavior was because of what she had been through, the abuse and stuff she had seen in that household. She was being told it was a secret what goes on in that house. She can't say nothing to nobody about. And that stuck in her mind,
M's been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Joanna says she's on 5 different medications.
She's on Adderall. I can't remember all them names. They're funny names. Something for sleeping, ADHD, something to make her more focused. But she's been through a list of medications since I've had her. Some of them didn't help her because she was seeing things, and some of the stuff she was taking was making her see more things. You know what I'm saying?
My question is, she's a child. You wonder, how long or how these experiences might stay with her as she grows older. Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I think she'll be troubled the rest of her life with the life she's lived so far, That's why I have her in with a psychiatrist, psychologist, and trying to keep her involved in the church and stuff like that so she can keep her mind off of it. Hopefully I can get her into track this spring, give her that outlet to, use up some of that energy because it's nonstop at home.
There seems to be a lot of love in Joanna's eyes as she looks at her granddaughter. Like most 11-year-olds, M's idea about what she wants to be when she grows up changes almost daily. A teacher, a babysitter, a track star. As we wrap up our conversation, we get to talking about how tall M is and her love for track and basketball.
I'll be 7 foot. Just watch. Just watch.
That's pretty daggone tall.
And everyone will love me. Yeah.
Okay. Why would you want to be so tall?
Because I can, I don't know.
Touch the ceiling instead of jumping?
Yes, I like jumping. I love running, and I love doing everything that's tall related and running, really.
As you said that, you just stretch your arms out real wide. It's almost like you like to take up a lot of space. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and I also might be the tallest person in the world soon. Just watch.
No, we don't want to go that far.
I do. 10 feet. Yeah, that's what I'm going for.
That would be awkward.
You remember, Nana, do you remember Wilt Chamberlain? Mm-hmm. I remember there was a Life magazine had a picture of he had a little sports car, and they had to put his seat in the back seat of the car because he was so tall. Because he was 7'1", something like that.
Get on Google and ask about Wilt Chamberlain. It'll come up.
Yeah.
He was a famous basketball player, one of the great ones. He was the only guy who ever scored 100 points in a game.
But guess what? I'll score more. Yeah.
What?
I'll score more.
Oh. Okay.
I'll practice basketball all night, all day, and every day. Yes.
M's body and brain continue to process unimaginable trauma and loss of both of her parents and her home and friends in Mississippi. Her grandma, Joanna, is also grieving. suffering the loss of her daughter, and her dreams of retirement. She's also raising a young girl who potentially has struggles ahead. And yet, Joanna seems to be providing a nurturing, safe, supportive environment for Em. And Em says she kind of likes school and has friends there, and she loves her teachers. All of these ingredients in Em's life are what experts like Kathy Zafran say are the positive essentials needed to overcome the long-term effects of trauma.
Kids need to know that someone loves them. They need to have hope. Something as simple as hope that it's going to be okay is critical. Imagine a life without it. Imagine if that child didn't have grandma who rescued her. What if she stayed in the foster care system and was bounced around and had no one to connect to? We have a lot of children in the system like that.
Zafran has been a licensed professional counselor in West Virginia for 30 years. She works primarily with high-risk foster care children who have lived through significant trauma. Zafran says early in her career, she and her colleagues were taking the wrong approach with the kids they were trying to help.
We were failing on a couple levels. We were trying a variety of things to get the girls that we worked with to, I'm going to use the word control, because that's what it was at the time, their behavior. So we did things like point systems, level systems, all these things to try to regulate externally what was happening to these girls in their world so that they could, I'll use this word, to behave, right, and stay out of trouble. And then one day someone recommended that I watch this video by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime.
Pediatrician Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's TED Talk, nearly a decade ago, had a massive influence on Zafran and many others. At the time, Burke-Harris was running a children's clinic in an underserved San Francisco community. The research she's talking about is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, widely known by its acronym ACEs. Doctors and researchers from a major California healthcare system and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, conducted the study. Around 17,000 Kaiser Permanente members participated over a 2-year period in the mid-1990s, split evenly between men and women. Their average age was 57. 80% of the study subjects were white, 10% African American, 10% Asian, and Native Americans made up less than 1% of the group. The survey consisted of 10 questions about traumatic events before the age of 18. The study's trauma categories include childhood neglect and abuse, including emotional and physical neglect, and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. The rest of the questions ask about family dysfunction, including substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation and divorce, domestic violence, and incarceration of a family member. Every category marked yes adds 1 point. People end up with a score from 0 to a maximum of 10 points. Researchers then looked at the mental and physical health outcomes of the 17,000 adults in the study. The survey concluded that the more traumas in early life lead to the risk of poor health outcomes later on. The research got almost no attention when it was published in 1998. Today, its findings are considered groundbreaking. Someone who answered yes to 4 or more of the 10 questions was twice as susceptible to heart disease and cancer, and 4.5 times more likely to become depressed than a person without as many childhood traumas. The likelihood of suicide is a significant finding. An adult with a score of 4 or above is more than 40 times more likely to attempt suicide than a person with a score of 0. And a person with a score of 6 or more has a shortened life expectancy of almost 20 years.
So there was that initial direct correlation between higher adversities, long-term health outcomes. It was that simple. And I don't think they even thought that would happen, but it did. Then everyone then started looking at it.
Here's licensed counselor Kathy Zafran again.
How do we now take this and utilize it to mitigate those adversities, to have better outcomes for children as adults now who had these adversities, adverse childhood experiences?
The Adverse Childhood Experiences study showed that adversity is very common. 67% of people surveyed reported at least one childhood trauma, while 11% said they had 5 or more. That original study has been repeated many times with hundreds of thousands of people. They all showed that significant adversity leads to chronic illness and disease. The trauma-informed movement has latched on to the adverse childhood experiences research as scientific proof of adversity's consequences. Many believe if people just learn about the science, it will lead to a more compassionate, healthy, and just society. And so, interest in the study has exploded in recent years. It's not just that the research is considered important from a disease perspective. Since the initial work, new research offers strategies to lessen the impacts of trauma, even prevent it. They range from self-compassion and art therapy to programs helping single parents stay healthy and employed, to learning brain science so parents can soothe themselves and their children. Across the country, advocates are rallying around these optimistic trauma-informed messages. They're sharing information and education about the study and ways to heal from trauma. They're lobbying institutions to take a closer look at this research. In West Virginia, Zafran helped form a coalition in the hopes of making an impact in the state.
I am just so tickled that it surfaced in West Virginia in the most beautiful grassroots way, that all of a sudden all these people just came out of the closets, not literally, but you know what I mean, out to just say, we need to learn more about this and we want to share this. That's one thing about the ACEs Coalition. It's not just a professional group. We have folks on there who are just have lived experiences, who want to be part of it. We need to hear what they have to say. So how do you get this message into every corner of West Virginia so that we all can engage with each other in a trauma-informed way? How do you start basically sharing this? There are folks across the country looking at how do we form this type of engagement that helps everyone be heard, have a voice, and feel supported and be connected to others.
The Adverse Childhood Experiences study from 1998 is now fueling a growing movement. Some call it a revolution. It's dominating the trauma-informed campaigns in schools and health policy on a national and international scale. But some, including one of the original researchers, worry the study's popularity is giving it unintended uses. Coming up after a break, a closer look at the movement to heal adverse childhood experiences.
It's clear, it's there. A child whose brain is steeped in cortisol and adrenaline is going to have structural and functional changes that are going to predispose that child to having those health issues. At the same time, though, if we can buffer with more positive childhood experiences, we may be able to turn that around. That's the hope, and that's the proof. We've got proof you can turn this around.
And those who say the well-intentioned, seemingly progressive framework is flawed.
So if we just accept it and we don't consider the potential ethical concerns and consequences that have been raised throughout the history of the ACE movement, as it's often called, the ACE campaign, then we are potentially pathologizing those with high ACEs and oftentimes not accurately recognizing the driving factors that are actually causing outcomes attributed to ACEs.
That's after a break. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation. This episode is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and this is Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. A social movement has been gaining steam in the last decade. Advocates are getting traction with trauma-aware campaigns and coalitions. School districts, communities, states, and even countries are investing in trauma awareness training and screening. As we mentioned earlier in this episode, the 1998 Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs as it's commonly known, has come to dominate discussions on the consequences of trauma early in life. The original survey is a simple framework of 10 questions related to childhood abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. It's the first of many studies showing the correlation between adversity in childhood and poor health outcomes later in life. People who take the test score a point for each adverse experience or trauma. That total from 0 to 10 is their ACE score. The higher the score, the greater the chances of developing serious and chronic diseases. A high score can make you vulnerable to conditions like cancer, heart disease, depression, and suicide. And it's also linked to learning and behavioral problems. Recent research shows exposure to chronic and unrelieved stress weakens our immune system. Advocates believe healing our bodies and minds starts with knowledge, like understanding our ACE score and the traumas we've faced.
When I first learned about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, I was not as far along in my journey of being able to look at something and not make it all about myself as I am now. So when I first read the study, I freaked out. It terrified me.
Carrie Sipp is a white woman in her 60s living in North Carolina. Sipp says as a child she saw her violent alcoholic father beat her mother. He came after her, too.
He shot at us one time. We had gone to get my puppy. He had taken my puppy with him to a friend's house, and I was scared he would hurt it. And so we went to get it. And as we were pulling out of the driveway to leave this other person's home, he pulled out a gun and shot at us. And my mother pushed me into the floorboard of the car. And I didn't remember that for many, many, many years. But there were bullet holes in our home where he had shot the walls, and there were scars on tables where he would take a knife, and just tables that my mother had paid on to have nice things. He could be very destructive. But he grew up in destruction. He grew up in a very violent home. So, people do what they learned unless they learned something different.
The repeated exposure to serious trauma had agonizing consequences. Just as Sip started college, she began having mental health problems. She couldn't focus. She says it felt like her brain was in a baggie. She struggled with classic symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but wasn't diagnosed until her 40s. She says everything came together for her when she learned about the ACE study. She realized the repeated exposure to trauma was the root of her lifelong struggles.
I had 2 little kids, and here was the study, and I knew that I had a lot of ACEs, and it was like, how am I going to stay alive to see these kids grow up? When I saw that I had more than 6 ACEs, and that someone with more than 6 ACEs is likely to die 20 years earlier than the general population, it scared the heck out of me, and I knew I needed to start taking really, really good care of myself. When more good news came out about that your brain is elastic, or plastic rather, and your body wants to heal, that was great news. That news turned it around for me, and I saw it as something that I could leverage as opposed to something that would be a cudgel, a bludgeon.
The brain science Sip mentioned is an essential part of understanding the risks of childhood adversity and learning about the way the body can heal itself. At this point in our story, it's important to know a little bit about brain science and how the body's stress response system works. Do you remember the TED Talk clip we played earlier in the show? Pediatrician Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, now the Surgeon General of California, gave her influential TED Talk nearly a decade ago on the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. In this clip, she describes the link between the body, brain, and toxic stress.
Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
Dr. Burke-Harris has helped share the science of trauma's consequences on the human body. Her TED Talk was followed up with a popular book in 2018. All the traction around the trauma-informed movement convinced Carrie Sip to dedicate her professional life to what she and other supporters call the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, movement. For the past 3 years, Sip has been a regional facilitator for a national organization called PACES Connection, the acronym for Positive and Adverse Childhood Experiences. The nonprofit group acts as a resource on all things related to the Childhood Adversity Study. It also builds awareness on how intervention can prevent adverse events and ways to heal toxic stress and even rewire our brain. Sip has tried many of the healing strategies. She says neurofeedback and other trauma-informed programs help her feel more joyful and resilient more of the time.
I think a lot of us walk around dysregulated so much of the time, which means that we're going to be in flight, fight, freeze, and we're not going to be coming out of our thinking brain, but coming out of our emotional brain. And we're not going to make the best choices out of that. So programs that can help us learn how to be present, mindfulness, meditation, music, art. We heal it through art.
SIP says research shows that positive influences and experiences can counterbalance the negative effects of a traumatic childhood.
If a child remembers experiencing community traditions, if your little town has a Christmas tree lighting and every year that's a great thing, or the Easter egg hunts, or the maypoles, or the 4th of July barbecues, those are positive childhood experiences. And if your parents or caregivers had you participate in those positive experiences, that helps build the neurons that fire together, wire together. That helps wire your brain for more positive experiences. Also, having friends, a supportive group of friends in high school, feeling as if you belong, which, in high school, who really does feel as if they belong? But, if you have that sense, and then this is the thing that I think is so wonderful, is that two people other than your parents, outside of your family, your immediate family, who love you and think you are special and have high regard for you and are very interested in your well-being. So we can make those things happen in communities, just like there's a science of hope, and we can teach the science of hope, for crying out loud. If a kid has hope, that's a better indicator of how well they're going to do in college than their SAT scores.
The global pandemic has made it much harder for all of us, especially kids, to connect and benefit from the hope that comes from those connections. Kids continue to experience isolation, disruptions in school, and a lack of in-person social interactions. Health and community services have also been less available during the pandemic. All of this has led to a mental health crisis for young people. According to U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy, there have been big increases in anxiety and depression. He says from 2009 to 2019, the suicide rate among 10 to 24-year-olds increased 57%. Young people most affected by the pandemic include racial and ethnic minorities, low-income people, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. These are the same populations, the CDC reports, are likely to have high childhood adversity scores. I asked Carrie Sipp how the pandemic has changed her work.
The pandemic has brought to light so much more about the racial inequality in this country. We were already very into looking at and practicing racism as an ACE. I mean, for a kid who is constantly oppressed because of his or her race, that is a huge adverse childhood experience. So we were already onto that. But to see what has happened with the racial reckoning, the fact that George Floyd was killed 3 months after the pandemic started, and I was looking at these numbers saying, my God, more Black people are dying than white people. There's a disproportionate number of deaths. I think that the pandemic has made it so clear that our public health system is not working for everybody at all.
Since 2020, all 50 states have been collecting adverse childhood experiences data through a state-based telephone survey of American adults. Sipp says with the number of ACEs screenings on the rise, there's more data to work from. She would like to see more action on the federal level, for Congress to hold hearings and to support solutions from trauma-informed intervention programs.
This is the root of all our most intractable problems: violence, incarceration, poor health, poor mental health, addiction, abuse, kids who don't do well in school, crime, hospitalization. I mean, the root of all of this, or almost all of it, comes from adverse childhood experiences.
Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris has been a zealous supporter of the ACEs framework. She believes screening for ACEs is just as essential as her stethoscope to prevent negative health outcomes. And she has called the findings from the Childhood Adversity Study as consequential to the evolution of public health as germ theory. That work on childhood trauma prompted California Governor Gavin Newsom to appoint Burke-Harris as the state's first ever Surgeon General in 2019. One of her first acts was to create an ACEs-aware program to train 20,000 healthcare providers in trauma-informed care. Dr. Burke-Harris wants to reduce adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress by 50% in one generation. New California laws support the program. They require Medicaid doctors to screen patients with the ACEs questionnaire to get their scores. And recently, California's governor signed a law requiring private health insurers to cover the screenings. Many advocates, including Nadine Burke-Harris, want to see ACE screenings become commonplace at schools, in the doctor's office, and in other settings across the country. Screening for adversity may seem like a good idea. After all, we screen for developmental disabilities and smoking and drug use, which can lead to early interventions. But education scholar Alex Winninghoff questions the value of widespread screening. She believes it's inappropriate, maybe even damaging, to screen individuals with the 10-question childhood adversity survey.
As a diagnostic tool, or as a framework for what constitutes or how we regard adversity, it has a number of problems and inadequacies.
Winninghoff is a doctoral candidate at the University of Georgia in the Department of Education Theory and Practice. Her research focuses on the adverse childhood experiences study and the resulting advocacy campaigns. Winninghoff says even a lead researcher of the original ACE study questions how it's being used today.
Dr. Robert Anda has explained that as an epidemiological tool, it may have value in helping us to understand from large population samples potential outcomes and making those correlations, but it doesn't scale down, and it was not meant to be scaled down on the individual level. But what it does do is it potentially stigmatizes young people by assigning a reductive numeric value to complex, layered experiences.
Winninghoff says there are many ways the individualized ACE scores could harm the people it's intended to help. The CDC says that populations with the highest adversity scores are Black, Hispanic, and multiracial people, those with less education, the poor, the unemployed, and the LGBTQ community.
So if we're thinking about the use, for instance, of an ACE score in relation to healthcare as a potential data point for assigning risk by insurance companies, if we think about the ways that the ACE score could be interpreted by professionals, including educators, social workers, police, we can see that that number as a kind of reductive, summative representation of someone's previous experience also projects a future story that can be dismal and devastating. So the use of the ACE score as a label to imagine potential risk and to give us information about what that person's likely outcomes are going to be in terms of education and social functioning and health. There are a number of ways that the interpretation of ACE scores could be deeply problematic and consequential at the systems level.
Winninghoff and other critics worry the ACEs framework can label people, and those labels can carry with them expectations that can, in turn, perpetuate racist, classist, and cultural disparities.
when a teacher sees a behavior in a student that's not congruent with the expectations of that school, or that falls out of the expected behaviors of that school, that teacher might examine that student's behaviors and think, oh, well, they're misbehaving, or they're acting in this way because of their high ACEs, or they're not learning my lesson because of their high ACEs, rather than recognizing, for instance, that student is in a school system that, as much as we would like to believe that schools across the nation are nurturing and safe places, we also know that currently they're a place of culture wars. We know that they're a place where students are experiencing systemic racism and experiencing forms of oppression that are created and perpetuated in schools. And sometimes those responses from students and those behaviors are legitimate responses to the school and the circumstance that's happening within that school. So by reframing that as a product of their ACEs, we're missing important communications from students who students and families who are demanding more from systems and demanding more equity.
In many ways, some of the things that we're talking about that are focused on in the ACE studies, if we looked at it as a pie, it's a wedge of the pie. And it seems to me like what you're saying is there's a lot more of the pie that we're not really looking at and considering.
Yeah, and when we emphasize and prioritize the ACE framework, there is potential to deny or
to let racism off the hook, to let poverty off the hook.
Yes, absolutely. To steer our attention away from the ways adversities are created by a vast range of other factors, including systemic factors like racism and impoverishment and the products of multiple forms of oppression. But when we point our attention specifically toward ACEs, we can evade those other conversations. So when we exclude racial trauma, intergenerational trauma, traumas created by impoverishment, and those that are systemic from a number of sites, including our social institutions that are implementing trauma-informed practices, and in many cases mandating that people confess or share their ACE scores with those institutions, that doesn't necessarily have an impact from the person being screened as being compassionate. It can be, in fact, incredibly dehumanizing.
Winninghoff says we need to critically examine the implications of widespread screening for childhood adversity. The 10 ACE questions focus on a range of issues, but she believes the approach is too simplistic.
This is a framework that has real consequences and can negatively impact lives and can further contribute to the ways people are viewed or recognized as being deficient, And so it would be wonderful if this was a simple solution that resulted in positive material impacts that resolved the multitude of problems that they're aiming to address. But as long as we prioritize ACEs, then we are denying the need and the urgent call to address systemic racism, to address the ways that impoverishment is impacting families. That is trauma. Until we address those issues, we are not, in fact, trauma informed.
California is the largest scale example in the country of the ACEs framework on a policy and legislative level. But many school districts, cities, and even countries like Scotland are using the framework to increase trauma awareness. Since Washington State passed the first ACEs-related bill in 2011, more than 130 laws and resolutions have passed in 39 states and the District of Columbia. And in the past couple of years, there have been bills for ACEs training and statewide ACEs awareness campaigns. All this action is a bit head-spinning. We all experience trauma differently. It's based on many factors, including our family backgrounds, our relationship to stress, and a host of other biological and sociological factors. Because we all experience trauma differently, there's a vast range in how we display the consequences and the results. Do you remember the young girl I talked to at the beginning of the show? We're calling her M, and she was at home when her father shot and killed her mother. She now lives in West Virginia with her grandmother. I mentioned how poised and polite she was, and yet I also knew that she was coping with the effects of extreme toxic stress and trauma. M's grandmother says she still shows many effects of her trauma. I saw it myself. But she can also appear confident and thoughtful. We are all complex. Advocates say an awareness of the role trauma plays in many people's lives can lead to a more equitable society. They encourage us to assume everyone we meet has had some kind of adversity. Abuse and neglect can contribute. So can societal wrongs like poverty and racism. To appreciate another person's trauma, compassion is essential. We all have problems and live with the consequences. But if we want to understand each other, baggage and all, we need to set aside judgment. With that comes hope and the confidence to keep going. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Marisa Helms, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to Bonnie Dunn, Martha Jo Wright, Kelly Caseman, Dr. Michael Brummage, Tricia Kingery, Bobby Spry, and the West Virginia ACES Coalition. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. Lelena Price provides us with images for the web. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. This episode is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.